Alright, what's up, Dragon Brood? Aetherdrift is about to drop on MTG Arena, and I know some of you are going to be light on resources, so you may not have a lot of wild cards as far as rares and mythics go, so we're going to help you out here and tell you what has actually been overperforming so far in this first kind of early release week. We're also mostly only focusing on rares and mythics because mostly everybody gets a fair amount of commons and uncommon wildcards that there's no reason to really worry about those too much. Additionally, there will be an accompanying video, so at the end of this one, if you want to know what not to craft, you can check that one out as well. And if you want to buy any of these cards or anything else, be sure to check our friends over at Tales of Adventure. You can use code DRAGN, DRAGN. It'll save you 5% on your order. And finally, if you want to get this sweet shirt, there'll be a link down below as well. You can check that out and you can be supporting the channel that way too. Anyway, let's talk about some cards to save you some time and effort. We're going to start by talking about Ketramose, the New Dawn. And this card is both kind of weird to build around, but also very easy. So it's also one of two pseudo-controversial cards that are going to be on this list. But the reason I included it is that if you like the style of deck that this card requires, which is basically an Orzhov deck that wants to be exiling a bunch of things, geez, I better talk right or this is going to be a long video. But if you're looking to play Orzhov that actually is exiling a bunch of stuff, this card's going to be for you. And it's not that hard to do. There's a bunch of cards that exile things right now in Standard, so very viable for sure. I don't think you want to have this if you're trying to play something like Orzhov Bats. That's not the type of deck that really wants this. So yeah, you want to stay away from it there. But if you already play the type of Magic or like building the type of decks that this card goes in, it is a safe one to craft, just not one that everybody playing Black-White needs to craft. Next up is Brightglass gearhulk, and several of the gearhulks are probably going to make this list. But Brightglass in particular, it's fairly easy to cast. It's a sizable body. It comes with First Strike and Trample, so you get two good abilities, but it gives you the ability to play some fun toolboxy things. So especially if you're playing best of one, and you don't necessarily want to put in a bunch of stuff to deal with graveyards. It's like, okay, maybe you put in the vacuum, right? Or maybe you want a way to remove artifacts and enchantments. You can include the Might, right? That actually is an artifact for 1 mana. So there's a few different things you can do that actually are pretty good here for this deck. But beyond being able to do all those little fun kind of toolboxy things, it is just a solid body. So you can play it in any type of aggressive green-white decks if you really want to. It can also fill in decks where you need artifacts or artifact creatures. Don't know if this fits into any type of delirium packages, so probably not there, but it does go into a fair amount of decks. So if you craft this, you will probably find a use for it later, and that's really what you want to have if you're going to be spending wild cards on something. Yeah, Monument to Endurance, there's no surprise here. I think we saw probably 6 different builds that were able to play this card. Basically, there's a bunch of ways you can discard in Standard. You can play super aggressive with cards that care about you discarding and getting bonuses. You can just play a bunch of enchantments and draw and discard or whatever that way. You could play just a long game with blue-white, blue-red, red-white, that's just taking their time to discard over the course of several turns. And if you get these in multiples, they're even better. So yeah, I am pretty sure this card is going to find even more uses than what we know about right now. So this is probably one of the safest ones on the list. Like, just a really good all-around card, and likely only gets better the longer it's in Standard. Riptide Gearhulk is one of 3 Gearhulks, and I've mentioned earlier there's going to be a couple on this list that actually make the list, but this one's actually kind of surprising because it doesn't seem like it should be spectacular, but honestly, being able to remove any threat to just tuck it away for a couple of turns has turned out to be very strong, and the prowess does actually matter. Now, what type of decks actually want this? Well, we've seen it in a variety of things. There's been some mid-rangey control stuff that wanted it. We've actually seen a lot of decks that are playing the Simulacrum Synthesizer. This fits perfectly with that, buying you those extra turns, having a big body. It does have double strike. It counts as an artifact and a creature. So it does quite a few things here. The cost is a little prohibitive, so I don't think this is something you need to craft like 4 of and throw into a deck. But I do think if it fits, crafting 2 is probably a safe move. And if you find out you want more, then go ahead and craft those later. But 2, I think, is a safe start on this one. March of the World Ooze is the second controversial card on the list. And this one, I was a little bit torn, but here's the thing. I think this is also one you don't necessarily need 4 of unless you have some way to trick it into play. And we have a video, maybe I'll remember to link it here, that we actually played it with Collector's Cage, and it was spectacular. And we hit it quite a lot. So, yeah, this thing just ends games possibly as early as turn 4 if you get it. But I do think there's other decks that are things like elves as an example that can just generate mana and creatures, and you just cast it on that turn and attack for a ton and win. Those type of decks could probably play 2 copies of this, right? You can even play Genesis Wave to just get it that way as well, right? So there's a couple of different ways you can trick it into play. Maybe you do want 3 or 4 copies in that list. I do think it's also possible that if you're playing maybe best of 3 and you know your games are going to go long, this isn't a terrible sideboard card. If you know you're playing against something that has a bunch of counters, well, they're going to be at least giving you 6/6s every time they counter something or kill something on your turn. So there might be more uses for this card. So I wouldn't go crazy, but if you're thinking about it, 2 is at least a safe start. Check it out. Unless you're already checking or playing a list that's actually using it and has done well with it, then feel free to go for it. The one thing I will say though is, while this is a useful card and will probably still be playable for a long time, I don't think it goes in a huge swath of decks. You're not just going to play this in a bunch of stuff because you're playing green and creatures. Like, for example, some mono green builds may not want it, some dinosaur builds may not want it. So don't think of it that way as something you're going to put in a bunch of stuff. If you like a certain style of deck, well, this is already good, or you need a win condition for decks that can generate a lot of mana, this is one you can consider. All right, the last gearhulk that makes our list is Oildeep gearhulk. And this one's more useful than it looks on its face. And it already looks really good. But this is a 4 mana 4/4, still castable, even though it is like double color mana. We have a lot of multi lands right now in standard, so that shouldn't be a problem. The abilities it has are both very good, and it's hard to get rid of because of the ward mechanic. But even more importantly, don't forget that you can target yourself with this card. So if you just have a land you're sitting on and you're digging for an answer, you can do that, right? You can be disruptive to the opponent, or you can get yourself an extra card to just like filter your hand. And the fact that it has lifelink is great for some of these mid-rangey to control blue-black decks, right? You have a creature that can block something while also gaining you life, likely kill something because it's a 4/4 body. So yeah, this card actually turned out to do a fair bit of work. Now, I don't think it's like a game breaker by any means, but it's just as enough of a nuisance as it needs to bother your opponents while still just being generally useful for you for playing it. I expect we're going to see a lot of this card show up probably as we get closer to standard rotation next year, but I think even now in the short term, it will see a fair amount of play. Regal imperiosaur. There's not a lot to say about this. It's a 3 mana 5/4 that pumps other dinosaurs, which means if you have multiples, they pump each other, which is cute. But honestly, we played this in a mono green list, even with I think only one other dinosaur, and it was totally fine. A 3 mana 5/4 is hard for your opponents to deal with, especially in a world of nowhere to runs that are trying to give it -3, or against the mono red decks playing lightning strikes or lightning helix in some of those decks, right? Like 4 toughness really does mean a lot. And the fact that you can get that for just 3 mana is huge. And then if you happen to be playing other dinosaurs, that's just a bigger bonus, or getting them in duplicate. So yeah, if you're playing those aggro green red, mono green, maybe even some green black versions if you're trying to just go big for efficient costs, this is one that you could consider playing. But I think if you're going to play it, I don't think you're going to have to worry too much about crafting it. Like, this is a sizable body, and it's going to be hard for them to make something that's any bigger than this for the foreseeable future. So those style of decks are probably always going to play this card. Just 3 mana for a 5/4 is hard to turn a nose up at. Yeah, I think if there was a single overperformer here in this first pre-week, if you want to call it that, it was probably Draconautics Engineer. This card did so much work. Like, one, it's a goblin, so all right, cool. It actually found its way into several different goblin builds. Being able to give everything haste is huge, especially when you're talking about wanting to play something like Krenko that wants to immediately make a bunch of goblins. Like, that's actually just a generally good ability. My goodness. But you can pay 4 mana and just get a 4/4 late, right? You top deck it. It's like, all right, I have 6, 7 mana late in the game. I top deck this guy. Great. I have 2 bodies and one of them flies. So it's threatening early, it's threatening late. It fits a variety of builds. There's not a lot to complain about this card. It's even only 2 mana to get onto the battlefield, so it's early and efficient. It checks a lot of boxes, like just generally really good. But not just that, it plays really well with another card in the set that I think you might also be safe crafting, and that's Afterburner Expert. Like, this card found its way into a whole variety of decks. Like, combined with the Draconautics Engineer, you ended up seeing some variations of green-red goblins, which was kind of wild because this card happens to be a goblin. It also works with anything that's wanting to fill the graveyard, and you have anything that has exhaust, which is awesome. But even better, this card actually technically triggers itself, right? So you have one in play and you put the 2 counters on it, and then the one in the graveyard comes in from or enters the battlefield from the graveyard. So you have a lot going on with this card, and it fits a whole host of things. Like, even if you have a deck that just wants to be able to discard to get some value and then get it into play later, that's a thing. I don't think we've seen everything we can do with these 2 cards. So I expect these will be, at least for this coming standard season, very played in a lot of different decks. Probably into the next season as well, if I were guessing. I also feel like this list wouldn't be complete if I didn't at least mention the Verge lands. Like, we've seen how the others have played, and they have been good. So the new 5 are also going to be very played. And anybody who builds a lot of decks will tell you there have been a lot of instances where you wish you had the proper Verge for the deck you were building. So yeah, if you're thinking about playing the proper colors where it makes sense to play this land, then go ahead. The one thing I will say though is, don't think of this as just being an automatic, in this case, red-white land. It actually is white first, red second. So you could potentially replace a couple of planes with it and still always have the same number of white pips in your lands, if that makes sense, right? You can't just automatically replace a red-white land with it, counting on it being a red mana early, because, well, if you draw it early, it's not going to produce red, so you can't get your 1 or 2 mana thing onto the battlefield. So just something to think about whenever you play these, but these should be safe as well. I'm sure if you look around, you see any of the creators playing stuff, the previous Verge lands show up in a lot of different lists. These should be no different. And while I don't think this is an exhaustive list, this at least should help give you some direction, and the explanations at least help you kind of discern what to be looking for when you're crafting stuff early in a season. But like I mentioned in the beginning, don't forget, we do have another video that's going to tell you what not to craft as well, so be sure to check that one out. That's all I have for now. We'll see you next time.